So I have the pleasure of introducing Ralitsa Hiteva today, who's going to give our first talk for this seminar series, where we've combined forces with the Digital Geographies research group at the RDS to give you this series of talks addressing really the intersections between the digital and energy as major areas of research. So Ralitsa is based at the University of Sussex, where she works as part of SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit, and she works on issues of infrastructure, energy governance, innovation, and low carbon transitions. And her research includes, well, multiple projects. There were so many there to sort of talk about, so I've just picked out a couple of ones I thought were interesting. So she's done several projects as part of CREDS, the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, and she has EPSRC funded work on the environmental impact of digital technologies for health and well-being in the home, which leads very nicely into, I think, her talk for today, which is titled Digital and Energy Landscapes in Independent Living, the Case of Digital Technologies for Health and Wellbeing in England. And we're very excited to hear from you today. So I'll hand over to you, Ralitsa, to hear your talk. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. So this presentation is going to build on the last EPSRC project that I had the pleasure of PIing. And it was a really big collaboration between several universities. So Cian O'Donovan from UCL, Kate Simpson from Imperial, Rafael Torpani and Alejandro Gallego-Schmidt, who were part of the University of Manchester Tyndall Centre, Sarah Boyston, based in Anglia Ruskin University, and SPRU's own Adrian Smith and Tim Foxen. So by all means, this was a big joint effort. This particular project also built on very strong partnership with NHS England, and NHS Digital Orbit, which is it's one of the largest housing associations in England, and a digital system developer called Apello. This was work that was funded from the EPSRC. Oh, sorry, skipped one. Yeah, it was funded by EPSRC and ran between September 2021 and March 2024. In essence, this very complicated and very fun project was carried out in 3 sheltered housing schemes in England. One was based in Rugby, one was based in Hastings, and one was based in Stratford-upon-Avon. So when I say independent living or sheltered housing schemes, these are specific terms used in social housing for specialized type of housing for healthy and able people over the age of 55. And many of the people that we worked with protest that 55 is really, really young. And I have to say that I was really glad that we had a really good spread of ages between 55 and our oldest participant was 101-year-old when the project finished. So the sheltered housing schemes were really schemes with individual apartments, and the common thing between them was that each of the schemes would have a manager that would manage the building, and would also have a special type of digital system called a warden call system. So you can see the tablet, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. This tablet is something that you could find on pretty much any wall in the corridors of the scheme, and also in the corridors of any of the individual apartments. The system itself was quite complex, and it's something that I could get into it. But essentially, not only did we study this particular warden call system, but we also studied the way in which residents interacted with it. And that took many, many different forms, but I would just say that a mammoth amount of cake and tea was consumed as part of this effort. So one of the core things that we did is we did LCA mapping. So we looked at the life cycle analysis of the ward and call system. We also specially designed a suitcase of future digital technologies to talk about what are the kind of digital technologies that residents would like and would add value to their lives. We also did a trial where we gave out a number of technologies such as smartwatches, speakers, Bluetooth speakers, and iPads and smart tablets to the residents in order to be able to observe how they interact with them. So having, giving you a kind of an idea of the kind of things that we did for the project, I just want to open up the kind of open up understanding of the relationship between digital and energy, particularly in the way in which we experienced it as part of the research. So first of all, I would say that digital turns out to be one of the first things we learned from the project is that what is digital and how digital technologies are perceived is very subjective, and it could mean anything from the complex server kind of setup that you see on the left of the screen to the way in which if digital technologies were not understood, quite often they were operated in the same way as the analog products that they replaced. And you can see on the right-hand side, this is one of the most common kind of emergency handle systems, the red handle that residents can trigger if they have a fall or they're not feeling very well. So essentially the ward and call system was a big digital platform with individuals consoles, which has multiple functions. The primary function of the ward and call system really is to raise the alarm. It comes with a specialized office team. If somebody presses the alarm button, within less than 30 seconds, they'll be connected to a specialist type of call center, or have all their details and be able to provide first aid assistance. However, the ward and call system also has other functions which were a lot more popular in the schemes, including the ability to use it as a door opening system. So it allowed residents not only to speak to people who were at the front door of the scheme, that's the building, but they can also see them, they can talk to them, and if they wanted, they can buzz them in. And this was one of the most popular functions of the system. It also had social functions, such as they could make free video calls to any of the other apartments in the same building. So with that in mind, I was going to say that what is digital and how it interacts with energy turns out to be very messy, not only within the project, but in the way in which it was actually understood, not only by the residents, but also by the different partners in the project. So one of the biggest jobs as part of the research was that we created a map of the digital ward and call systems in the schemes. And in particular, this was built not only on our observations of the built environment, multiple interviews and workshops with the digital developers, the operators, and also with the residents. And the map thing looks like this. So very roughly, it has multiple interfaces. Some interfaces are meant to predominantly provide interaction for the residents. In other interfaces, you can only interface with the scheme manager via the scheme manager, and also includes a lot of things that happen in the background. For example, offsite monitoring, the call centers, the cloud, the smart networks that support all the different functions. And one thing I want to raise your attention to is the air conditioning unit. I mean, the air conditioning was so out of the initial idea of the system mapping that we only included it because we took a very nice picture of it. And that actually bears a kind of huge importance to how we understood the interaction between digital and energy. So as part of the mapping and as part of the life cycle analysis, we spent a lot of time. When I say we, the majority of the heavy lifting was done by my colleagues in Tyndall Center, Alejandro Gallego-Schmidt and Rafael Tarpani. They're brilliant at this. But it was about putting together what was included behind the scenes. So quite often when we talk about the system, what the housing association operators and the residents really saw was the smart tablet or the intercom, which was at the doors. But there were a lot of additional kind of infrastructure and services that were supporting it, from the electric cables that you see up there to the actually stationary and mobile phones that were needed in order to operate the system, to the servers. And one of the things we found out is that actually the server room is a particularly important space in the scheme. And the reason for it is because very few of the schemes in which we actually worked, and as a rule, very few of the existing more than 9,000 schemes, independent schemes in the UK have server rooms instead. A lot of the servers are either put into cupboards, basements. In a lot of the cases, we saw servers that were put in the corner of the scheme managers' offices. And the interesting thing is that almost all of them have been provided with an AC unit. And this plays a big role because no one was actually sure what the AC unit was for. No one particularly made the direct link between the AC unit and the servers. And in cases where the servers were in the offices of the project, of the scheme managers, quite often the assumption was that the AC was there to serve the human rather than the server technology. In a few of the cases, and in one of the field sites that we had, there was no air conditioning in the server room. In another of the sites that we had, there were two air conditioning units because the servers were split in different rooms. And in the third one, there was one server next to an aircon. So that was one of the reasons we also focused on these specific three schemes. So the scheme in total served 188 residents. The other big aspect of the life cycle analysis was actually, once we've put together what's included in the system, we started taking things apart. And particularly the kind of the primary interface for the digital system itself, which is the tablet, was taken apart. Everything was measured, everything was weighted. And Rafael and Alejandro did months and months of research in trying to identify what is the environmental impact of each of the components. And the kind of the cataloging of all the parts and materials was actually a lot less exciting than probably anybody thinks it is. There was a lot of printed circuit boards, a lot of packing materials, metal screws, batteries, plastics, and so on. Alongside this type of life cycle assessment analysis, we were also carrying out a lot of engagement and interaction with the different partners. And we found out that almost all of the warden call systems in the UK, and particularly the one that we studied, the actually design decisions around how the software was housed in the smart pad were down to the manufacturing facilities where these were put together. So there was very limited input in terms of the amount of printed circuit boards, whether a substantial part of the packaging was plastic, metal, and how big were the batteries. So these were decisions based on whatever was available and on cost. However, once we've done this, we were also collecting simultaneously. We collected a lot of information, trying to understand the energy use of these technologies in the schemes. And our initial assessment, and something on which we based a lot of the activities very early on, was that perhaps the biggest impact was in terms of missed communications through the digital technology. So these are calls didn't actually, calls that they were abandoned, video calls that they were not made, not using the equipment as frequently as people should have, and so on. However, when we put this side by side with the LCA analysis, very interesting and unexpected outcomes actually emerged. So we found that when we were looking at the mass of materials, most was to do with packaging, then printed circuit boards and batteries. And that had specific implications for understanding their environmental impact. So we looked in particular the plastics and the metals as the two biggest types of groups, and how they were, how much of plastic and metals was between the different elements of the Warden Call system. But I'm going through these quite quickly because the kind of the more interesting detail comes a bit later on. So we found out, this is basically a comparison between the life cycle environmental impacts of the digital technology as it was installed in the 3 schemes in which we studied. The interesting thing here is that we found that the system itself on average would emit 2.30 to 4.83 million tons of CO2 equivalents, or that will be the equivalent of anything between 35,000 and 74,000 small petrol cars in the UK context. So it was, in a way, you would think that individually the carbon emissions impact is not that big, but when you consider that the UK is moving towards every single of the 9,000 independent living schemes to have such Warden Call systems, then obviously the impact was significantly bigger, particularly if we're looking at a sector and a country that has a net zero target. So what did we find out when we compared what we have learned from breaking down the materials and looking at the energy use? We found something quite unexpected, and that is that the biggest environmental impact, half of it comes from the electricity, which is used in order to maintain a constant temperature or to cool the server rooms, and the other half came from the materials. Our initial expectation that recycling and the recycling potential will play a big role, we found that not to be true. As a matter of fact, we thought that recycling has a very small contributions to make in general. So what are the implications of that? When we considered the cradle to grave environmental impact of these systems, we found out that more than 90% of the electricity consumption came from air conditioning, and particularly it was closely linked to the environment within, the spaces within which these server rooms were actually put in. And it also came down to poor levels of understanding of how what the requirements of the electronic equipment and how it actually operated behind the scenes. So a lot of the other environmental impact also came from the production of metals, which were actually essential aspect of a lot of the manufactured digital components. And they included things like gold, silver, copper, and they were all in the printed circuit boards. So at that point, we see that 2 things are of huge importance. One is the space and the air conditioning requirements of the server room. And the other one is the requirements for producing the printed circuit boards. The other big distinction that we found, and I think it's quite important when we're thinking about the interdependencies between digital technology and energy, particularly in these spaces, is that we found that the environmental impact of the electricity, of the server room in larger schemes was, without an AC, was almost half of CO2 emissions per resident per year than it will be to a much smaller scheme, which has 2 ACs. So you can see here the comparison speak for itself. One of the smaller schemes, which had only 40 residents and 2 ACs, and that had to do with the requirements of the server room, had 70 kilograms of CO2 emissions per year per resident, while the scheme with 90 people without AC had 35. So you can see that you, in a way, whether you have an AC or not, and how this is operated and what kind of space the server room is placed in, could lead to halving the energy demand for operating these technologies. Right, give me a second. Whoa. Okay, so I have no idea. I don't know whether you can see that there is a big block on. Do you see a big block on the left-hand side?
Yes.
I have no idea what this is, and this is new, right? So apologies. I will share. I didn't pick up on this before. This has just come up. But essentially, on the basis of these findings, we identified several key areas for change. I mean, one of the simplest things that we could recommend is that we can basically help reduce the electronic equipment requirements by about 20%, and that's by introducing things that would actually work for any kind of technology, such as making sure that the usage of the technology is optimized by making sure that it's interoperable with assistive technologies and with personal kind of technologies such as smartwatches, iPads, and any kind of Bluetooth speakers. Also, that there is a kind of purposeful and strategic understanding of the role that the design of the server room actually plays in the minimizing the requirements for cooling. That could be achieved in many ways. For example, the big scheme with 90 residents, which did not need an air conditioning unit, was due to the fact that the server room was in the basement, and that was not a really cool place. Also, low-tech solutions could be implemented, such as making sure that there is a airflow in the server rooms, or you can look for other type of solutions, such as making use of renewable sources, such as solar panels and battery storage, in order to power the AC. But the main thing was that having a server room significantly increased the potential of any of the social housing providers to reduce their associated carbon emissions. And a lot of the kind of key areas where there was potential to influence positively the environmental impact over, of the digital technologies over their life cycle was making sure that ward and call systems have clear guidelines about what the optimal spaces for the server operation. So, for example, whether the air conditioning unit and the size of the servers were actually matched, when exactly they needed to be switched on and when they needed to be switched off. Simple things such as retrofitting existing server rooms in order to make sure that they're properly insulated. And a lot of it was information in this particular area of change that no one had. The housing associations were saying, well, we didn't put the air conditionings there. Like the Warden coast systems came with air conditioning. The digital developers who installed them said, well, we've installed the system, we've given them the air conditioning, and they have to figure out how to operate it to kind of reduce their carbon emission and make sure that optimize the energy demand. And residents actually did not even know that there was air conditioning unit and server rooms. So it seemed to us that one of the big positive changes that could be made was in the attitude towards circularity principles and the extent to which they were actually embedded in the relationship between these different stakeholders and in the whole procurement process. So things such as making sure that there are clear details about the quantity and type of recycled materials that need to be included in Warden code systems, as well as description of what the end-of-life destinations for the equipment, particularly for metals and printed circuit boards, to clearer guidelines and even clearer boundaries of who's responsible for what when it came to operation and installation guides for these systems through their lifespan. And this could take multiple forms, but it seemed to us that the easiest thing would have been if there are kind of joint training and joint kind of knowledge exchange between the different stakeholders, that are the digital developers, the housing operators, and also the third-party installers that quite often got involved in these processes. But also there was a great scope to, if you designed a software, why would you not think about what are the kind of the design elements that you want to build in, such as the ways in which the system itself could be designed so there are less logical circuits and electronic components, which would significantly reduce the materials. But I would say that although it's quite clear how these type of improvements could reduce the environmental impact, I would say that one of the biggest scopes, one of the areas with the biggest scope for change was actually the way in which all these stakeholders thought about the digital technologies in these spaces. The assumption was that they were plug and play. And as a matter of fact, that was a feature that a lot of the housing associations were looking for. They didn't want the type of digital technology systems that are going to lock them in particular costly investment and upgrading of their schemes. They wanted something that could just be plugged in and requires minimal maintenance. Well, I'm fairly confident after 3 years of research to tell you that nothing is plug and play. We tested, we did a trial where we also hand out to residents a lot of Fitbit smartwatches, Bluetooth speakers, and iPads, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to hell just for the things that put over 100 people through. One thing was quite clear, that it doesn't matter how smart the technology was, proactive action was needed for every single type of digital technology that needed to be used in the independent living schemes. And particularly, you cannot really, there was very limited value for residents from an attitude which assumed that everything is plug and play and that all these different stakeholders needed to provide was someone who can help the residents if there was a problem with an individual technology. As a matter of fact, we found that one of the main reasons why residents did not use the technologies is because they couldn't explain what was wrong. Quite often they'll come to us and they will say, oh, this one doesn't work or this one is broken. And that could be a multiple reasons of where the issue could be. So I would say that stop thinking about digital technologies as plug and play and make sure that proactive action is taken by all these stakeholders is one of the most important takeaway messages. Also, we have to move away from this plug and play business model towards a model of building continuous maintenance and evaluation of digital systems. And that means that we regularly evaluate how suitable it is, not only for sustainability purposes, but also for the evolving context of people's life in these sheltered schemes. So that basically means a very different approach to the current state of affairs, where you learn together and there is closer cooperation between the technology developers and housing providers. And one of the biggest things that was very disappointing to see is that, as a matter of fact, the residents, the primary users of these technologies have very little input in not only the design of the processes through which the digital technologies were acquired, but also for which they were basically evaluated. And this is a great picture of some of the residents that we worked with. As part of the trial, we actually had to design a catalogue introducing the digital technologies that I could pick from. That was a lot of fun. The last things that I wanted to highlight are 3 points, which I think speak to the level of complexity and potential areas for future research that we can focus on when we're looking at the way in which digital and energy intersect. So to assume that the relationship between the digital technologies and residents is straightforward is as foolish as to assume that there could be a digital plug and play technology in these spaces. As a matter of fact, we found that their digital misunderstandings were really ripe in the schemes. And the digital misunderstandings were to do with the fact that there were big differences in the way in which the system was perceived by different stakeholders. So the digital developers, like Capello, they were absolutely confident that they had developed an emergency alarm system whose primary kind of aim was to save lives if someone was not feeling well. And that was also the reason why the housing associations have actually picked this particular hub, digital system. From the residents' perspective, they thought that the system was a great door opening system, which allowed them to talk and see people at the door. And as a matter of fact, many of them didn't even think about the additional features such as life-saving and raising the alarm. And it was not perceived as a system. So that meant that quite often there was very little understanding of what was the reason why it wasn't operating and the way in which it was operating and the different ways in which it could be used. The other thing that plays a very big role on how digital and energy actually interact in this space is that we found out that the way in which residents actually encountered the system and used the system was through multiple proxies. So proxies could be anyone from scheme managers, relatives, spouses, neighbors, friends. And in a few of the cases, IT support, in a way, was being provided by relatives who were in Australia. And they were trying to help residents navigate how to use their smartwatches, for example. But anything to do with learning, using, troubleshooting of the digital technologies quite often involved multiple proxies. So there were a lot of people who were quite often giving contradictory advice on what was wrong and what was the proper way of using something. That meant that quite often the use of proxies meant that perpetuating negative myths and perceptions about the technology was quite common. So were the kind of common incorrect ways of using it, or assuming that good service mean one thing and not another. So what does that mean? That means that these type of proxies and digital misunderstanding mean that word and call systems, which quite often are the primary type of digital technologies that a lot of the current generations of residents in sheltered schemes are encountering. It means that they become digital gatekeepers for other technologies. And while we were working in the schemes, we noticed that a lot of this digital gatekeeping was closely related to the introduction of smart storage heaters in these spaces. So that means that there's great potential to examine the relationship between the two and how hopefully learning to use one could support learning for the other. And I think this is the kind of this is the end of my presentation. I'm quite happy to answer any questions and to focus on particular aspects that you want to know more about. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now, but we also have a LinkedIn page where we've put in a lot of the information that we've gathered, particularly for the different types of industry partners that we worked with.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I have so many questions, but I want to give other people opportunities. So if you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A. Does anybody else have a question before I take chair's privilege?
Yeah, I think I'm also would be abusing chair's privilege, but I have lots of questions too, so I might jump in and give the others time to enter. I think you have to enter your questions into either the chat or the Q&A. Is that right, Amy? They can't ask questions directly?
I believe
in this
so,
function?
unless someone on the other side sees that they can unmute themselves, that would.
In which case, go for it. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, well, my first question, I've got quite a few, but my first question was about your kind of last points around what people are actually using these systems for, and the kind of just opening the door, and they weren't really using them or seeing them as something really integral to their experience in these assisted living places. So I wondered about, my question was, are these really needed? And who is making those decisions about installing these digital technologies, and what is their rationale for installing them? Is it future proofing? Is it essential for, sort of resident safety? And yeah, kind of just a whole set of questions around, are these needed and from whose perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, Catherine. I mean, one of the points we try to make to housing associations quite strongly is that if you consider the environmental impact of these systems as door openers, that's really fancy door opener with a huge, kind of carbon footprint. And if you, one of the things that really attracted housing associations to these type of digital ward and call system was the plug and play. The idea that you literally kind of install them in a wall and kind of you're done, and that they would be interoperable with a lot of assistive technologies, and they will be interoperable with a lot of consumer technologies like smart watches. As a matter of fact, it took 4 people with PhDs to figure out how to link one of these tablets with a smartwatch or a Bluetooth speaker. So you can imagine. And also the other thing is that it required that there was sufficient Wi-Fi connection in the space in which you wanted to do this. And that seemed to be a big stumbling block. So on one hand, you have this technology with huge environmental impact, which is not really being used for what it's designed, and it's not being used for its full potential. And on the other hand, you have a significant number of the residents in these spaces are social residents, and they, in order to use these technologies, they have to pay for Wi-Fi connection. And we found out, for example, that a lot of the social tariff Wi-Fi connections did not provide sufficient broadband in order to use these technologies in the assistive way in which they're being used. So I would say that there is a lot to unpack, but they could be, there is a lot of proactive work and investment that needs to happen in these spaces if housing associations and NHS want to use these technologies to their full potential. But at the same time, this is going to come at a cost.
Follow up, could they not do it? Like, where's the push for doing all this digital coming from? And like, that's what I'm, interested in. Yeah.
Right. So, I think it has to do with the big changes within the housing sector. In very simple terms, these technologies are quite often sold as clear environmental wins because they can significantly reduce the number of actual people you need to have in the schemes in terms of support or managers. And the other thing is that they're also branded as being able to shift a lot of the back office support provided by carers and housing associations from people on site to actual call centers, and even from call centers into Q&A and chatbots on these devices. I would say that there are very few people of the more than 100 residents that we worked with for more than a year who would be able to successfully use chatbots in a way that's going to help the housing association provide sufficient quality of care. And it will also not going to be a significant point of frustration and confusion for the users. But that's my main message. If there's one thing that's remembered, it's not plug and play. And please be proactive in the way in which these kind of technologies are actually embedded, not only socially, organizationally, but also in the physical environment. So that's why we had a range of recommendations, from server rooms to changes to the procurement systems to, you need to know certain things about digital technologies and how residents actually use them.
Great. So we've got a question from Olivia, and then I'll come to yours, Amy. And then we'll do mine and use my chair's privilege. But so Olivia's put, thank you so much for that interesting talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the smartwatch trial. What were the residents using these for? Was it mainly to connect to the system? And did you analyze those in relation to energy consumption, materials used, etc.?
Oh, yes. I mean, I would say the smartwatches were the biggest waste in terms of resources. So when we started the trial, we created a catalog with just 8 technologies that we used. And we provide an opportunity for the residents to pick what they wanted. And the smartwatches, so we bought Fitbit watches, and they were the most desirable item. They were also the item that was discarded most quickly. So I think by week 3 of the trial, out of I think we handed 26 smartwatches. I think we had about 4 in operation. As a matter of fact, they have, they were put, it was quite interesting. It was so funny that I started including a question in the questionnaire of what drawer do you keep your smartwatch in? And quite often, without laughing, people say it's in the same drawer I keep my fort pendant. So a lot of the assistive technology that residents are issued with initially, if they have mobility problems, is a pendant they're meant to wear all the time. And majority of people don't wear it. It's stuck in a drawer. So yeah, they were discarded quite quickly. And the reason they were discarded quite quickly, I believe, was because there was very little value that they actually provided to the residents. When we introduced them, we showcased that they could be linked to the actual interface, the smart tablet, so they could use a bigger screen in order to actually be able to see all the information that's provided. And a lot of people were interested in it, not because of any kind of prestige that the brand offered, but because they were interested in finding out more about their health. And particularly, they wanted to be able to prevent any health problems. However, this was one of the areas which really quickly taught us that you need to have a good Wi-Fi connection in order to be able to link the two technologies together. And as a matter of fact, I would say that it took most of the residents 3 to 4 weeks to realize that you actually need the Wi-Fi connection in order to make it work. And that's one of the kind of the spottiest elements of how digital technologies are embedded within social housing. That's because very few of the schemes actually provide a Wi-Fi connection as part of the rent. It's something that's considered a luxury, and it's something that people have to pay in addition. And the majority of them go for social tariffs, which we find out that the bandwidth is not enough in order to make sure that you can link successfully the two. The other thing that was, I think it's a design fault of the social tariff, is that you need to kind of have another 2 logins in order to kind of log in properly. And we found that even if residents knew all the passwords and they start the process sometimes would take more than 15 minutes for them to input the username and password, during which time the interface has timed out and they have to start again. And I think a lot of them just gave up. But again, smartwatches were a brilliant example of how it's not plug and play for so many reasons. I can tell you which one was the most successful and used one. Bluetooth speakers.
Go on, tell us more.
Bluetooth speakers, they were the most used technologies, even at the end of the trial. And that, I think it's one of the other findings I haven't touched on, is how gendered the digital technologies are. And we found that digital technologies like Bluetooth speakers work really well for both genders. And that, I mean, they used it in different ways. For example, a lot of the women used it for entertainment purposes, particularly if they had caring responsibilities, if you had to entertain grandchildren. That was great. And a lot of the men used it. I want to go with entertainment. They interacted with it in a way that it was almost funny. So basically, they used it to have these kind of complex conversations. So quite often, after the first week of the trials, we'll talk about the different personalities because we gave 2 types of Bluetooth speakers, and one of them had an Alexa, and the other one had a different name for the for the interface system. And people were genuinely having discussions about which one's better, and whether, you know, Alexa was blonde or brunette. And yeah, I mean, I would say that it was used in very different ways, but people interacted with it the most. And it was one of the most straightforward things that once you kind of connected it, it stayed quite stable connection for a long period of time.
Okay, Amy, did you want to ask your question?
No, I will let you have chair's privilege and you can ask a question as I'm conscious of time.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks. This has been so interesting. I'm really interested in like the sort of cultural references that your participants drew on to describe these technologies. So whether that be the sort of associations that with sort of stakeholder groups, rather than the residents themselves, whether there was sort of like cultural, whether from film or TV or from somewhere else that they were using to describe or brand these technologies. And then secondly about so how the residents felt over the course of the project, like whether it changed how they felt towards living in that kind of space, and whether like well, it's not really instruction, their increased awareness of the system and of things like the AC unit, whether that changed how they felt about where they were living.
Okay. In terms of cultural references, unfortunately, there wasn't anything that we explored a lot. We did notice that there was a big division in terms of the digital labor involved in the schemes. So whenever we had couples that participated in the research, it was usually the guy who had the newest type of mobile phone, and the woman will have, you know, something less recent. But we found that women did a lot of the digital work as well. If there was need to explain something, to go and check if something works okay. Even most of them had to press a button once a week on Monday. The scheme manager will send them a message asking, "Are you okay?" If they're okay, they press the button to say that they're okay. And basically no one bothers them. If they press they're not okay, they will have a follow-up phone call from the scheme manager. And almost inevitably, in cases where they're couples, it was the woman that will press that I'm okay, which was obviously a bit funny in cases where the woman was okay, but the man wasn't. So yeah, there was a strong gender aspect. In terms of the other question, I'm sorry, I forgot what the other question was.
It was just about whether whether the residents' increased awareness around the technology like changed how they felt about their living space.
Yeah, with some of them, I have to say we had a mixed bag of results. I'm pretty sure that we single-handedly put off a certain number of people from digital technologies forever. I would say that there was a very decisive way in which I was summoned in some of the schemes, so they will return to me what they haven't used, which was a very bruising experience. But I think it also spoke of the level of frustration that a lot of the residents are forced to live with, considering that a lot of the vital services that they need access to are becoming digital. And that's kind of the big impact that this has on their lives. There were also people who had a better understanding of the warden call systems themselves. We had a number of success stories where people really liked the technology they were given as part of the trial, such as the Bluetooth speakers, but they said that this is enough for me. we found out that negative experiences were kind of amplified and passed on to other types of smart technologies, but positive experiences did not necessarily translate into desire to try more digital technology. Which in its own right, I think, makes a strong case for a lot of proactive action and investment. I think it's really unfortunate that the approach of a lot of the housing association is that the help is there, they just need to ask for it. And there's so many barriers to asking for help around digital technologies that you don't fully understand.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got 2 minutes. So Amy, did you want to ask a question?
Maybe I could ask a quicker question. So I was really interested. I mean, it was an interesting talk. Like all of it was really interesting. Really enjoyed it. But I was particularly interested when you're talking about sort of the areas for change, and in particular the idea of that relationship with circularity principles. So I was just wondering, who do you think should be responsible for sort of supporting that process and perhaps funding it? Like, how can we facilitate those changes?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I mean, one of the, it's a little known fact, but a lot of the cost of the warden cost systems is actually passed on to residents in the schemes. So the energy that's used for cooling the server rooms actually is shared between all the residents, and it's part of their service charges. Yeah, so I would say that, I mean, a lot of the investments that housing associations make with these digital technology comes through grants, comes through their access to low interest rate funding, but also comes from the residents themselves. And with a lot of the circularity principles, you would actually lower the maintenance costs. So these are basically costs that you can pass on to, the cost reductions that you could actually argue that you can pass on to the residents themselves. So, for example, plastic casing might be quite cheap, might be easily available, but it also it's not very durable. And in some of these cases, you might be able to actually use the casing for maybe 5, 6, 7 years. So one of the things that we looked at in particular were the fact that you can make the interface panel much smaller, and a lot more of the actual functions could be based off-site in the cloud. So that would mean that if it's a smaller panel, there's going to be less manufacturing cost, and there are going to be much better ways of providing energy for the cooling in central servers as well. But I would say that one thing was quite clear. I think the real danger of the plug and play as a business model for this is that it helps the housing association significantly postpone much needed upgrades on the built environment in the schemes. In particular, one of the crazy things is this particular digital warden call system. Currently, it requires 2 Wi-Fi connections. One serves just the need for emergency calls, and the other one serves all the other functions. And less than 2% of all the schemes, there's actually this dual broadband connection, because it requires to put wires through walls quite extensively, and that's considered to be very expensive. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of the housing associations favor this plug and play type of technology, which I hope I've made a strong enough case that it doesn't work.
Great, thank you so much. That was really great. Yeah, I think we should give you another virtual round of applause as well, with the emojis and physically as well. Catherine, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just to wrap up and say thanks so much. Ralitsa, it's a really, really fascinating talk. I've made so many notes, and yeah, I'm going to definitely be looking at the papers and the things that you've published. If you have anything to share, and we could also share it on our web pages alongside the recording of the talk, that would be great.
Great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just to say a huge thank you for just a really fascinating talk, and just got me thinking about all the problems now in this area. Just found myself going, no, quite a lot in my head. But yeah, really, really brilliant to hear from you. So thank you again. Yeah, I think that's it. Adam, do you want to have the last word?
Well, thanks everyone for coming as well. And just to say that the webinar series continues next week. And then I think there's a week break and then 2 more weeks after that.
That's right. Yep.
Yes, great. And next week there is a talk from Ola Milacek, who I think is University of Bristol, on digital twins.
Oh, Ollie's great. I'll be logging in for that.
Brilliant.
Oh, great. Look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you
Thanks
very
so
much
much
for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Good
you. Bye.
afternoon.